Hi, it's Nate Charles, and welcome back to the Rule of Law Brief. There is something happening in American politics right now that should alarm anyone who cares about the Constitution. Across the country, a growing number of Republican politicians are openly embracing rhetoric that targets Muslims as a religion and Muslims as a people. You can see it in congressional statements, you can see it in legislative proposals, and you can definitely see it in campaign ads. This is not an isolated incident. It is becoming an intentional, overt, and pernicious political strategy. One recent example comes from the Republican primary for Texas Attorney General. In that race, a candidate released a campaign ad claiming that the Democrats have imported millions of Muslims into the United States and blamed Muslims collectively for crime, terrorism, and supposed efforts to impose Sharia law in Texas. And you can refer back to my previous video about Sharia law. That's just a lie. This kind of rhetoric is not just inflammatory, it reflects something deeper and far more pernicious. Now, here's an important caveat. In the United States, people have a First Amendment right to express their opinions, even hateful ones. Politicians have that right as much as anybody else. Private citizens have that right as much as the politicians do. The Constitution protects speech we dislike, precisely because the government does not get to decide which opinions are acceptable. That gets to an issue called viewpoint discrimination, which is something I've also covered on this channel before. So when politicians make statements attacking Islam or Muslims, the First Amendment protects their right to say those things. But free speech cuts both ways. The Constitution protects their right to speak, and it also protects my right to speak and your right to speak, and in so doing, to recognize the bigotry coming from the Republican Party when we see it, and to call it out and call it for what it is. This issue becomes far more serious when that hateful rhetoric turns into government policy proposals. Some of the policies proposals now being circulated by the Republican Party include things like banning people who adhere to Sharia law from entering the United States, targeting Muslim nonprofit organizations with inflammatory and baseless allegations of being terrorist organizations, using governmental influence to dismantle communities viewed baselessly as Islamist. Those are not neutral immigration policies. They are policies aimed directly at a specific religion. And it is long past the point where it is a constitutional problem. Now, to look at just the recent history of these issues, it helps to look at one of the most controversial Supreme Court cases of the last decade. In Trump v. Hawaii, the Supreme Court upheld the first Trump administration's travel ban. This was more widely known as the Muslim ban. That decision was widely criticized, but it's important to understand what the court actually did. The policy that the court actually reviewed and upheld did not explicitly target Islam. Two prior versions of the policy did. And there remains little doubt that the principal motivation for the policy that eventually passed muster was to target Islam, but the Republican Party did just enough to make the policy facially neutral. The quote-unquote Muslim ban managed to pass constitutional muster because it was framed as a restriction on entry from certain countries justified as part of a national security review of visa vetting procedures. Because the policy was facially neutral, meaning it did not explicitly single out a specific religion, the court applied an extremely deferential standard and allowed it to stand. The policies that have come up more lately don't even have that pretext. That distinction matters. A policy that appears neutral on its face, even though it may be motivated by prejudice, raises difficult legal questions, but a policy that explicitly targets a religion is something very different. And that is what we're starting to see now. The First Amendment contains two key protections: the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause. Together, these two clauses of the Constitution form what is commonly referred to as the separation between church and state. Together, they prohibit the U.S. government and state governments from singling out a religion for punishment, exclusion, or hostility. The government cannot declare that one religion is inherently suspect or incompatible with national identity. The government cannot impose policies that treat members of a particular religion as a class apart. When politicians propose policies that explicitly target Muslims as Muslims, they are colliding directly with one of the most fundamental protections and one of the most fundamental rights and fundamental values embodied in the U.S. Constitution. And history offers us a very clear warning about where this kind of rhetoric leads. The Republicans have expressed some dismay with the public at large calling them Nazis, but the Nazis are the closest analog to what we are seeing right now. When governments begin identifying national identity in terms of religion or ethnicity, the next step is almost always legal discrimination. Again, the Nazis are the most infamous example. In the late 30s, they passed something called the Nuremberg Laws, which stripped Jews of citizenship and treated them as a legally inferior class. The policy proposals that are being forwarded by the Republican Party in the United States today are not fundamentally different from the Nuremberg laws of Nazi Germany. The underlying logic and bigotry are identical. They begin with the claim that a minority religion is dangerous, alien, and incompatible with national identity. And those are sentiments taken almost word for word from recent Republican politicians. Then it moves towards policies designated to exclude or marginalize those groups. The 1930s Nazi Party of Germany shows just how dangerous that trajectory can become if it goes unchallenged. The United States was founded on very different principles. In America, the government does not decide which religions are legitimate. Catholics are free to be Catholic. Jews are free to be Jewish. Muslims are free to be Muslims. Atheists are free to believe nothing at all. Those freedoms are not conditional. The freedom of religion is the sine qua non of the United States. If we start attacking Muslims out of bigotry and out of a failure to recognize the inherent dignity of all humans, we cease to be the United States at all. There will be no more America left to defend. The Constitution protects the right of politicians to say offensive and even hateful things. But when those views turn into policies aimed at excluding or targeting an entire religion, that is no longer just ugly rhetoric. It becomes an existential threat far more pernicious than any one religion or ethnicity could possibly impose on the U.S. Constitution. And that is something that every American, regardless of politics, should and must stand up and reject. Every decent American needs to stand up for their neighbors and speak out against these policies immediately.